In my opinion, load selection, which is the intensity of which we train or how much weight we're actually lifting, is one of the most important variables we should control when creating a training plan. In order to develop muscle size and strength, we need to provide an adequate amount of stress for our body to adapt to. And if we are working with an intensity that is too low, too often, we won't get the results that we want. On the other hand, if we train with intensities that are too high, this is also not ideal, as it puts us at a risk of some negative training responses. These include injury. Even one poorly attempted rep at an intensity that is too high increases our risk of injury. We can reinforce bad movement patterns by lifting weights that force our bodies to resort to bad technique, or chronically training at an intensity that is too high can put unnecessary high amounts of stress through our body, which can be hard for us to recover from. This is where we see two common mistakes that people make with load selection: training with weights that are too light or training with weights that are too heavy. While both of these things can limit the results you are getting from your training, in my experience, training too heavy too often is going to be a lot worse for you and your results than consistently training with weights that are too light. Let me explain. In Module 3, we covered lifting technique and how important this is for long-term progression in strength training. In my opinion, this is the most important variable that will influence the success of a lifter. If someone is consistently training with loads that are too heavy, there is no way that they are able to maintain proper technique while pushing to failure or close to failure regularly. Lifting weights and getting stronger is not just about grunting out the heaviest loads that we can lift. Strength is a skill, and every time we set up to the bar, we are practicing that skill. If we practice the skill incorrectly with suboptimal technique, then what we are doing is teaching our body how to move poorly. If this suboptimal technique comes as a result of lifting too heavy, then we are also putting ourselves at a much higher risk of injury. Now, another thing is that it's so important to progress in our training. And if we are constantly lifting at our absolute max capacity, then there will not always be room to progress, because the fact is that strength gains aren't always linear week to week. Lifting the heaviest weight possible all the time might seem like the most hardcore way to approach training, but in reality, it's a very fast way to learn bad lifting technique, get an injury, or plateau. In my opinion, having the discipline to hold ourselves accountable and lift with the right intensity so that we can master our skills is a lot more hardcore. Now, on the other side of this, we have the lesser issue of training with weights that are too light. With certain populations or training styles, I think you could potentially see this quite a lot. However, with the kind of people that I work with, I'm far more likely to see people make the mistake of going too heavy rather than going too light. When we consistently train with weights that are too light, we risk the fact that we might not be optimizing our gains, as I mentioned earlier. But it also can get in the way of us learning the skill of lifting heavy weights. When we work at different percentages of our max or different intensities, there are slight differences with how our bodies coordinate our muscles. So the exact pattern that our muscles move with for an intensity that is, say, 50% of our max is a bit different from the exact pattern that they will use for the same exercise to lift at an intensity that is 90% of our max. The only time I see this really being an issue is for competitive strength athletes who have not practiced performing competition movement under heavy load that is close to their max. Since most people compete in strength sports because they love lifting heavy, it's pretty rare that I'll come across this. But the solution for these athletes is typically to include a number of practice singles at a high intensity at some point in their training. But again, the kind of people that I work with love pushing the weights up higher and higher each week. And that is especially the case with my strength athletes. Now finally, if we imagine a hypothetical situation where someone is lifting with an intensity that is too light, but they are also following the principle of progressive overload, which we are going to discuss next, then they will still be progressing over time, which is essentially all we need. Taking this approach also means that they have room to progress each and every week, even if they're having a bad week or haven't gained strength since the previous session. So if someone is able to progress their movements month after month, year after year, while still lifting conservative weights, then in my eyes, they've kind of won the game. Now, I don't want to go any further into depth and discuss percentages, RPE, velocity-based training, or any other ways of quantifying and prescribing intensity. These are things that we're going to cover in level 2 and 3 of the Strength System course, as they are a little bit more advanced. The most important thing that I want you to take home from this discussion on load selection are exactly what we have discussed so far. Firstly, strength is a skill, and you need to be working at the right intensity to develop that skill, which means that lifting max weights all the time is not necessarily the most effective way to get stronger. Secondly, you should not be sacrificing technique so that you can lift heavier weights. Remember that first point, strength is a skill. Technique takes priority. Thirdly, if in doubt, take a conservative approach, but just make sure that over time you are progressively overloading the movements. If over time you continue to overload a movement while staying within a conservative range, then you will make excellent progress and avoid training plateaus. And finally, if you do find that your strength starts to plateau and you are the kind of person that grinds out each rep in every session, but now the weights aren't progressing, then it's probably a good idea to take a step back. Lower the intensity and focus on practicing the skill of good movement. Almost all of the time, this will work. Now that we have covered everything that you need to know about lifting intensities and load selection, let's talk about progressive overload.